Amanda was a vibrant young woman when I married her, just 22 years old, glowing with the life of our child growing within her. Our decision to wed was hastened by the pregnancy, a whirlwind of emotions and responsibilities. Initially, life was good. Together, we built a thriving business, achieved financial security, and shared laughter as we envisioned a future filled with family milestones. But then came our son. Born with severe medical complications, his brief life was a storm of hospital visits and sleepless nights. When he passed, something inside Amanda broke. She drifted away emotionally, cocooning herself in a silence I could not penetrate. It felt as though I had lost two people at once, my child and my wife. The cracks in our relationship widened over time. Amanda became absorbed in charity work for terminally ill children, a cause born from her grief. Though admirable, it consumed her completely, leaving me feeling like an afterthought. Our once joint business ventures became mine alone to manage as Amanda retreated further. At first, I poured myself into work, hoping the distraction would numb my own pain and give Amanda the space she seemed to need. Then, one fateful evening, I stumbled upon her diary, accidentally left open on the kitchen counter. My curiosity overpowered my respect for her privacy, and I skimmed the entries. What I found shattered me. Amanda was not just grieving our son, she was resentful toward me, blaming me for his condition and even questioning the love that had once tethered us together. As I grappled with this revelation, Amanda's old college friend, Claire, re-entered our lives. A psychologist, Claire began visiting frequently under the guise of support, but there was an intensity in her gaze when she looked at Amanda, an almost possessive concern. My suspicions grew, and soon I confirmed my fears. Amanda had found solace in Claire, a bond that seemed deeper than friendship. Confronting Amanda about this only led to heated arguments, her accusations echoing the words from her diary. Amid this turmoil, another twist emerged. Our business manager, Kevin, who had been my confidant and friend for years, became a constant presence at the house, offering his help. It wasn't long before I noticed inconsistencies in our accounts. Upon investigating, I discovered that Kevin had been embezzling funds, exploiting my preoccupation with personal matters. Worse, he'd been feeding Amanda lies about my supposed financial mismanagement, driving a wedge between us. Desperate for clarity, I hired a private investigator. The results unearthed a network of betrayal. Not only had Kevin stolen from us, but he and Amanda had been in contact far more than I'd realized. They weren't romantically involved, but Amanda had leaned on him as a confidant. This relationship deepened her mistrust in me, as Kevin painted himself as the reliable figure I no longer seemed to be. To complicate matters further, Amanda's estranged father reappeared, claiming he wanted to mend fences. His return was met with Amanda's cautious optimism and my outright skepticism. He had abandoned her family when she was a teenager, leaving scars Amanda rarely spoke of. Yet she seemed willing to forgive him. I wasn't. My instincts proved right when he asked Amanda for money, pulling her into another manipulative scheme. It was around this time that I met Megan. A new employee at our company, Megan was sharp, empathetic, and genuinely interested in the business. Our conversations started innocently, discussions about work, strategies, and occasionally, life's complexities. Megan's warmth was a stark contrast to the coldness at home, and I found myself confiding in her more than I should have. Amanda, ever vigilant despite her emotional distance, noticed the shift. She accused me of infidelity, an irony that felt like a cruel joke given her closeness with Claire and dependence on Kevin. Her accusations were the final straw, unraveling the fragile threads of our marriage. We separated under a cloud of mutual distrust and unresolved grief. But even separation brought its own set of complications. Amanda's charity work had expanded into a full-fledged organization, partly funded by the remaining assets from our business. Her team included Kevin, despite my protests. Financial disputes arose, and our lawyers became the intermediaries in what felt like a war of attrition. One day, amidst this chaos, a letter arrived from Amanda. It was not a legal document or a plea for reconciliation but a raw, handwritten account of her grief, anger, and regret. She confessed to feeling trapped in our marriage after our son's death, yet unable to leave out of fear and guilt. She admitted that Claire had been a temporary escape but denied any physical affair. She wrote of Kevin's betrayal and how she felt used by everyone, including herself. That letter was the most honest communication we'd had in years. It didn't heal us but provided a sliver of understanding. We decided to sell the business, split the proceeds, and go our separate ways. Amanda continued her work in the charity, and I focused on rebuilding my life, alone but determined. Even now, years later, I wonder if we could have saved ourselves had we been more open, more willing to face our pain together rather than apart. But life doesn't grant do-overs. It simply moves forward, leaving us to reconcile with the choices we've made. Amanda stood by the mirror, fixing her earrings, her reflection calm yet distant. "I won't be late," she said, picking up her purse. "Brian's just been so helpful with the new project. Dinner is the least I can do to thank him." Her tone was breezy, almost rehearsed, and that only fueled the unease gnawing at my gut. Brian. The name had come up before, too often, in my opinion. He was her colleague at the charity, a financial advisor brought in to help expand their operations. I'd met him once, briefly. He was polite but had a way of making every conversation about himself, dripping with charisma that felt insincere. I dismissed him at the time, but now his name carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Amanda was out the door before I could respond. I sat in the silence she left behind, my thoughts spiraling. She'd been so guarded lately. Even mundane questions about her day were met with curt answers or a change of subject. Her phone, once casually left on the counter, was now always locked or in her pocket. And now Brian. I wasn't the paranoid type, or at least I hadn't been. But the changes in Amanda, the late nights, the vague explanations, the emotional distance, it all pointed to something I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. I needed answers. Not guesses, not assumptions. The truth. That night, after pacing the house like a caged animal, I opened my laptop and searched for private investigators. It felt absurd, like something out of a bad movie. But I couldn't shake the image of Amanda laughing over wine with Brian, leaning in just a little too close. My pride wrestled with my desperation, but desperation won. I sent an inquiry to a firm with good reviews and waited. The next morning, I received a call from a man named Carl, who introduced himself with a tone of practiced professionalism. "Discreet investigations are our specialty," he assured me after I laid out the basics of my situation. "You'll have your answers soon enough." A part of me hated myself for doing this. It felt invasive, underhanded. But another part, the part that couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything but Amanda's potential betrayal, felt vindicated. I gave Carl the details he needed, Amanda's schedule, the restaurants she frequented, and, of course, Brian's name. Over the next few days, I lived in a state of tense anticipation. Amanda continued her routine, seemingly oblivious. She mentioned another dinner with Brian, which Carl later confirmed was at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. He reported back the next morning. "They spent 2 hours at dinner," Carl said. "They talked, laughed a lot. Nothing overtly romantic, but their body language suggested a level of familiarity beyond professional." My stomach twisted at his words. After dinner, they walked to the parking lot together. No physical contact, but she stood close when they said goodbye. He lingered before getting into his car. It wasn't damning evidence, but it wasn't nothing either. Carl's updates became my lifeline. Each new piece of information chipped away at my sanity. Amanda and Brian met twice more that week, once for lunch and another time for what she described as a strategy session at the charity office. Carl documented it all, capturing images of their interactions that left little to interpretation. Amanda's laughter, the way Brian leaned in as if they were the only two people in the world, it was enough to send my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Finally, on a Thursday night, Carl called with news that shattered whatever hope I had left. "I followed her to a hotel tonight," he said, his voice measured but heavy with implication. "She met Brian in the lobby. They went up to a room together. I stayed as long as I could, but they didn't come back down while I was there." The air seemed to leave the room. My hand tightened around the phone as Carl continued. "I know this is difficult. I'll email you the report and photos. Take your time, and let me know how you'd like to proceed. I thanked him mechanically, my mind a blur. When the email arrived, I forced myself to open it. The images were clear and undeniable, Amanda and Brian walking side by side, their smiles too warm, their proximity too intimate. The final shot, her entering a hotel room with him, was the nail in the coffin. That night, I sat alone in the dark, staring at the photos until my eyes burned. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but part of me feared the confirmation. If she denied it, I'd know she was lying. If she confessed, I wasn't sure I could handle the truth. Either way, our marriage would never be the same. When Amanda came home later that night, I didn't say a word. She greeted me casually, her voice cheerful but hollow. "How was your night?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. The call from Carl came early in the morning, his voice steady but laced with a seriousness that made my stomach drop. "I've uncovered more about Brian," he began. "He's married. Wife, 2 kids. Lives about 20 minutes from your place. Married. With children." It took me a moment to process that. The image I'd constructed of Brian, the suave, single colleague swooping in to rescue Amanda from her grief, shattered. It didn't absolve Amanda of her actions, but it added a new layer of complexity, one that made my head spin. What kind of man, I wondered, risks his family for a fling with a coworker? Carl continued, detailing Brian's home life with the dispassion of a professional used to this kind of revelation. His wife was a schoolteacher, his kids in middle school. They seemed, by all accounts, like a picture-perfect family. "But I've got more," Carl added, his tone growing heavier. "And I need you to brace yourself for this." I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone tighter. "Go on." He began recounting the surveillance from the previous evening. They met for dinner at a bistro downtown. Nothing unusual at first, just 2 people having a meal. But the conversation became more animated, more intimate. There were moments where they leaned in close, laughing softly, their hands almost touching across the table. My chest tightened. I didn't interrupt, letting Carl continue. After dinner, they stepped outside. That's when they kissed. He paused, likely gauging my reaction. My silence must have spoken volumes because he quickly added, "I've got photos. Clear ones. No ambiguity." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, I managed to choke out. "They walked to a nearby hotel," Carl said. "A luxury one." They checked in together, Amanda handling the reservation. I followed them to the elevators, but there wasn't much more to see after that. I waited for 2 hours. They didn't come back down during that time. The images arrived in my inbox minutes later, and I forced myself to open them. There they were, Amanda and Brian seated at a candlelit table, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. The kiss was captured perfectly. His hand on her waist, her leaning into him. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of familiarity, of passion that wasn't new but cultivated. Then there was the hotel. The grand entrance, the concierge desk, Amanda's smile as she handed over her credit card. The final photo, them disappearing into the elevator together, felt like a knife to the chest. I stared at the images for what felt like hours, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Amanda's betrayal wasn't just an abstract fear anymore. It was real, tangible, and staring back at me through these photos. Brian's betrayal of his own family only added to the sickness I felt. That evening, when Amanda came home, I was waiting for her in the living room. My heart pounded as I watched her walk through the door, her demeanor casual, her smile the same one I had seen in those photos. She set her keys on the table and looked at me, her expression faltering slightly at my silence. "Something wrong?" she asked, tilting her head in concern. I took a deep breath, the words heavy in my throat. "Who is Brian to you, Amanda?" Her eyes flickered with something, surprise, fear, guilt. "What do you mean?" "He's my colleague. We work together." "I told you that." I pulled my phone from my pocket, the photos already open. I held it up so she could see, watching the color drain from her face as she processed what was in front of her. "You're lying," I said, my voice low but steady. "This is more than work. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her hands trembled, and she took a step back, as though distance could somehow soften the blow of her betrayal. "Say something," I pressed, my voice rising. "Explain to me how this happened. How you could look me in the eye every day while sneaking off with him." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why?" I demanded. "Why Brian? Why a married man with kids? Did you think about his family? Did you think about what this would do to us?" She crumbled onto the couch, her head in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said through sobs. "We started talking after work, and he understood me in a way I felt you didn't anymore. I felt seen, like I mattered. I know it's not an excuse. I know I've destroyed everything." Her words felt like a slap, her attempts at justification cutting deeper than the betrayal itself. "You mattered to me," I shot back. "But you chose to throw that away for him. For stolen moments in hotel rooms." Amanda's sobs turned into gasping breaths, but I couldn't comfort her. I couldn't even look at her without feeling the weight of what she had done. The rest of the evening passed in tense, painful silence. Amanda retreated to the bedroom while I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling. I didn't know what came next, but one thing was clear: the life we had built together was over. Whether it ended with a clean break or a drawn-out, bitter process, there was no going back. The moment I decided to retaliate, I knew I couldn't confront Brian head-on. It wasn't just about him. Amanda's betrayal had wrecked me, but knowing he had a wife and children added another layer to this mess. He wasn't just destroying my life, he was tearing apart his own family. I wanted him exposed, stripped of his facade. If Amanda thought Brian was her escape, I was determined to make sure she saw him for what he truly was. I didn't act impulsively. I thought it through, considering the risks and potential fallout. Then I made a call to Carl. "I need someone discreet," I told him. "Someone who can get close to Brian, but not in an obvious way." Carl was hesitant at first. "This isn't exactly in my usual scope of work," he said. But after I explained the situation, he agreed. Within a few days, he introduced me to Lily, a woman in her mid-20s with a knack for blending in. She had worked with Carl before in similar situations and understood the stakes. She was sharp, confident, and completely unflappable. When I met Lily in a quiet cafe to discuss the plan, I laid it out plainly. "Brian frequents the charity events Amanda organizes," I said. "He's at the office a lot, and I know the restaurants he likes. You'll cross paths with him, make it look natural. Your goal is simple: flirt, engage, and get him to show his true colors. He needs to be the one who makes the first move." Lily listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. "And when he does?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Get proof," I said. "Photos, messages, whatever it takes. And then we'll make sure his wife knows exactly who she's married to." Over the next week, Lily worked her way into Brian's orbit. She attended a charity event, posing as a potential donor, and struck up a conversation with him. Carl kept me updated on her progress, and it didn't take long before Brian took the bait. He was charming, of course, complimenting her, laughing at her jokes, and leaning just a little too close during their conversations. By the second encounter, he was texting her. Lily shared screenshots with me, flirty messages, veiled invitations, and a bold confession that he found her absolutely captivating. The man had no restraint. He barely knew her but was already arranging to meet her privately. The final piece of the puzzle came 2 weeks in. Lily met Brian at a trendy rooftop bar downtown, dressed to the nines and playing her role perfectly. Carl was stationed nearby with a camera, capturing every moment. Brian's intentions were clear from the start. His hand on her lower back as they walked in, the way he leaned in close when he spoke, the unmistakable kiss he planted on her cheek when he thought no one was looking. The clincher came when he booked a room at the same hotel he had taken Amanda to. Carl followed them discreetly, snapping photos as they checked in together. When Lily texted me later that night, her message was simple: "It's done." The evidence was damning. Photos of Brian and Lily kissing, entering the hotel, and text messages that left no room for doubt. I reviewed everything carefully, ensuring there were no gaps. Then I drafted an anonymous email to Brian's wife. The message was short but direct. Your husband is not the man you think he is. These photos were taken last night. I attached the clearest images of Brian and Lily, as well as screenshots of his texts. I debated whether to send it for hours, pacing the floor and questioning my motives. But every time I thought about Amanda's betrayal, I felt the same burning need for justice. Finally, I hit send. The fallout was swift. Carl kept an eye on Brian, and within days, he reported that Brian's wife had confronted him. She had received the email, seen the photos, and kicked him out of the house. Brian tried to spin the story, claiming he'd been set up, but the evidence was too strong. His wife didn't believe him. Word of their marital troubles spread quickly through Amanda's charity circle, and soon enough, Amanda knew as well. When Amanda confronted me, her face was a mixture of anger and devastation. "Did you do this?" she demanded, holding up her phone with the photos of Brian and Lily on the screen. I didn't deny it. "I needed you to see the truth," I said coldly. "The man you threw our marriage away for is a cheat. He doesn't just betray his wife, he betrayed you too." Amanda's expression crumbled, her anger giving way to tears. "You had no right," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't just about you or me, there are kids involved." I almost laughed at the irony. "And what about our life? Our marriage? Did that matter to you when you were sneaking around with him?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, clutching her phone like it was the only thing grounding her. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I didn't regret it either. Brian had destroyed his own family, just as Amanda had destroyed ours. All I'd done was reveal the truth. That night, as Amanda retreated to the guest room and the house fell silent, I sat alone in the living room. The sense of triumph I'd expected never came. All I felt was emptiness, a hollow ache where my marriage used to be. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, and I glanced up from my seat on the couch. Amanda walked in, her purse slung over one shoulder, looking tired but composed, until her eyes landed on us. Sitting across from me was Rachel, a friend I'd met through work, someone I had invited over intentionally. Her presence was part of the plan. Amanda froze, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone sharp. Rachel stood up smoothly, offering a polite smile. "I should get going," she said, her voice calm and neutral. She grabbed her coat and walked past Amanda, pausing briefly. "It was nice meeting you," she said, though the words carried a subtle weight. The door closed behind her, leaving Amanda and me alone. She dropped her purse onto the nearest chair and crossed her arms. "What the hell was that about?" she demanded, her voice rising. I stayed seated, staring at her for a moment, letting the silence build. Then, without a word, I picked up my phone from the coffee table and opened the folder Carl had sent me. I held up the screen, showing her the first image, Amanda and Brian at dinner, leaning close, their faces lit with a familiarity that was unmistakable. Her face went pale. What is this?" I didn't answer. I swiped to the next photo, the kiss outside the restaurant. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with panic. "I can explain," she stammered, stepping closer. "Explain?" I said, my voice cold. "Explain how you kissed him? How you went into a hotel with him? How you lied to me for months?" My words came out sharp, each one cutting through the fragile tension in the room. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "Please, just listen," she pleaded. "It wasn't like that. I was lost. I was hurting. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore." I laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to my own ears. "Hurting? So your solution was to sneak around with a married man? To humiliate me while pretending everything was fine? It wasn't about you," she snapped suddenly, her tears turning to anger. "I was drowning, okay? After everything with our son, I felt empty. Brian, he was there. He understood. He made me feel alive again, like I mattered." I stood, my fists clenching at my sides. "Don't you dare try to justify this," I said, my voice shaking. "I lost him too. I was grieving too. But I didn't go looking for comfort in someone else's arms. Amanda's resolve faltered, her anger giving way to desperation. I never stopped loving you, she said quietly. I didn't mean for this to happen. It got out of control. I shook my head, unable to look at her. You don't get to say you love me after this, I said. You had every opportunity to talk to me, to tell me how you were feeling. Instead, you lied. You betrayed me. She sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to fix this. I stared at her, the woman I had built a life with, the woman who had torn it apart. You can't fix this, I said finally. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it? For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs. I felt no sympathy, no urge to comfort her. The Amanda I once loved felt like a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. And what about her? She asked, nodding toward the door where Rachel had left. Are you trying to punish me? Is that what this is? I met her gaze, unflinching. Rachel isn't the issue here. You are. Don't try to shift the blame. Amanda stood abruptly, her shoulders trembling. You've made up your mind, haven't you? She said, her voice breaking. You're not even willing to try. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. As she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. This wasn't a fight we could recover from. It was the end.